And welcome to the September Elevate Monthly Team Call. I'm really excited about this month because I'm not presenting and someone fabulous is. Her name is Jenna Zajac, and she is a fabulous PT. Jenna and I are training together, so Jenna works with Nell as well, and she's a fabulous human. She's a fabulous PT, and tonight we're going to talk Jenna's going to talk about injury prevention and some best practices around that. I know with a lot of like training cycle after training cycle, we're stacking a lot of that, a lot of the running, and niggles can pop up, injuries can pop up, but there are some things that we can do to help prevent them. And also, Jenna will talk about like things to do when it comes up as well. So it's going to be a great combo. Please mute yourself if you're not muted already. And then I'll let Jenna take it away. Hey, Jenna.
Hey, all right. Well, that was a really kind introduction. But yes, I am Sarah's training partner. I'm a PT out in Boulder. So let me pull up. I haven't used this before to share screen, so we'll see how this goes. See.
Hopefully I don't have to give you permission because I don't know how to do that.
Let's see. It's one of those.
We may have lost her, everyone. She'll be back. She'll be back. Bree, Melody, great to see you both. Here we go. She's back. Hey, Melody, that was fun.
Picked me out. Okay, let's see. There we go. This should work now. Okay, can you see this?
Yes.
Okay. Do you just see like the main screen here?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to be talking about injury prevention for runners. I like to start off with like quotes here. So this is one of my favorite. It's from Zajac. He is a PT researcher out in Oregon. And he's done a lot with like professional runners and elite runners. You may recognize his name. He's written a couple running books, I believe, as well. But this quote of, you have to know how to move well before you can run well. So I like this for a lot of reasons that I'll get into, but as runners, we really just want to run like all the time. We're like, let's just run more and more and more. But understanding the basis of actually moving well to then improve your running is really critical. Mostly because if you look at the research, about 80% of runners are getting injured or are currently injured, which is really high compared to a lot of other sports, surprisingly. And up to 70% of these runners, and now I think it's closer to about 79, 80% are getting injured yearly. So I'm sure a lot of you can attest to that as well. We kind of go through this cycle, right? So we're kind of have these demands that are exceeding our capacity. We get injured or we get re-injured. We then have this reduced capacity because we're not engaged in the activities we were. Kind of we go through rehab, we return to our activity, and then usually we end up going through this cycle again and again through our running careers. And the biggest thing is that running injuries are really multifactorial. So I have a lot of athletes come in and they're like, why did I get Achilles tendinopathy for the 5th time? Or why do I have another stress fracture? Or, why does my IT band hurt? And things like that. And a lot of the time, to be completely honest, I just say, I don't know. There's so many things that contribute to an injury. So it's kind of peeling back those layers. We do know, though, that prior injury is the greatest risk factor for an injury, whether it's in the same area or a different area of your body. But what I look at is kind of this individualized risk of injury really relates to more this complex interaction between rapid changes in workload and then biomechanics. So how you're moving, your physiology, musculoskeletal qualities, as well as energy availability. So kind of how much energy in your body versus you're expending versus what you're taking in. So a lot of these things kind of are contributing and playing into why you might be injured. And when we think about, this idea of like too much, too fast, too soon, and then everyone says, oh, I just built up too fast or too much, is this always to blame? When we really think about, elite runners, professional runners, think about what they do in their training. So we know they're consistent. We know they have smart coaches, just like all of you have Sarah. And they also monitor their work and results. So they're looking at their training. They are looking at the results of their races. They're monitoring this over time, but they still get hurt, right? I mean, I know before the trials, Connor Mance had a femoral stress injury. Before the Olympics, Helen Obiri had a femoral neck stress fracture. Fiona had her calf or hamstring issues in the Olympics. So we do see these elites get hurt, but it's understanding like, why does that happen if they're doing all of these things? I say runners don't actually get hurt because of this gradual, consistent training and then loading their body well. What I see is runners actually get hurt because they are compensating and loading their bodies in odd ways for prolonged periods of time. So we see is that one person might be susceptible to a certain injury based on how they run. So someone might be more susceptible to like Achilles tendinopathy, while someone else may be more susceptible to a different injury. So maybe like IT band syndrome. And I usually say like one running form isn't necessarily better than the other. There's no perfect running form, but it's the idea that you are doing this activity and this motion again and again and again for prolonged periods. So if the form is kind of a little bit off, or there's something you're loading abnormally, you're repeating that so many times, right? And so think about if you have a bruise and you kept like punching your bruise, like it's not going to get better if you just keep hitting in the same spot. So little nuances can be essentially get off or be exaggerated. And as humans in general, in the US, we are more so, lazy or a little sedentary by nature, meaning that, again, this is very generalized, that running isn't part of necessarily our lifestyle or our day-to-day for like transportation or work, or where we're kind of on our feet and engaging in these things all day long. We typically are doing our run maybe in the morning, and then you're at work all day sitting at your desk, right? For an example. And so with that, the way we move in general, the way we swim, the way we bike, the way we run is going to be in a way that's most energy efficient for our body. Our body likes to take the path of least resistance, and the way that's easiest for our musculoskeletal and our nervous system to perform at a certain point in time. So you may have gone in, or maybe you have for like a running analysis or a gait analysis, whether it be at a PT or somewhere else, and someone might tell you, oh, you need to change these things about your running form. But essentially what I tell athletes is that, that might not work all the time, because like I said, your body's going to move in a certain way based on what's available to you at that point in time. So trying to do a specific change to your running form might actually cause a different injury, or it might feel very awkward and uncomfortable, cause you to run in a different way and, cause more issues or make you less efficient. So I call these kind of like the core capacities. So the way in which is most efficient is based on your mobility, stability, strength, and power at a certain point in time. So as a PT, I really emphasize these, and I am teaching runners how to be athletic, not just good runner, but how can you be athletic? How can you be able to perform all of these skilled movements that will naturally improve your running form? So, for example, we do a lot of gait analysis in our clinic. We have a lot of sensors that we're putting on people, so we get really granular data. And so I might see something, maybe their like dynamic stability is off, and they're a runner with like IT band issues. So I'm like, okay, let's like look at that and peel that back. And instead of, trying to change their running form and maybe saying, okay, well, try to run with a wider stance or try to increase your cadence, I might say, okay, let's work on, these hip stability exercises, because that will then engage your glutes, to help stabilize your pelvis while you're running to prevent all that hip dropping, which is going to take stress off your IT band. So kind of taking that approach to it as compared to just addressing, trying to make these big changes to someone's running form. And it really does go all back to this idea of capacity. So like I said, we move the best we can with this given combination of these core capacities. So can you move enough? Are you stable enough? Are you strong enough? And as a PT, I go back to that drawing board and I'm figuring out what we can tweak and how we can improve these certain capacities to translate to these improvements in running form. And it's this idea of capacity versus performance, right? So capacity, like I could tell someone to do something in the clinic, like, usually if you do try to alter someone's running form, if you say, okay, increase your cadence, or if you say, take longer strides or whatever it is, people can do it for like a minute or two. But when I'm thinking about the marathon, just these cues might not necessarily, or telling someone to move in a different way might not translate when you are exhausted at mile 22. I mean, everything goes out the door at that point, right? So it's how can I work on these capacities to then let it translate where it naturally alters a person's running form. And there's not really one magic pill, one magic thing to change everything and that everyone must do. So there's not like a specific drill that everyone has to do, or a certain cadence that everyone has to run, because everyone's really different. But what we can say is we want to do something that's going to improve that person's individual movement quality. And, a lot of athletes will also come in and kind of are stuck in this injury cycle. And they're like, it's fine. Like every 6 months I get injured. Like it is what it is. I always get hurt after a marathon or in training, but I work through it. And I'm like, well, let's stop just settling for that, right? Like, let's stop doing the best with what we have, and kind of work on enhancing these little things so we can then run with more skill and more coordination. And so I like this idea here. So you can see that guy over on the left, who's kind of like slouched, head forward, everything like that. So I would love for all of you, as you're sitting, to kind of, if you're not already, which some of you might be, slouching forward like that, putting your head forward, shoulders in, and try to take a few deep breaths for me. And then I want you to sit up nice and straight, open up your chest, kind of pull your neck back a little bit. So good sitting posture, and then take some more deep breaths for me. And what you should realize is that sitting up in upright posture, right, you can breathe a lot easier, right? And so what I talk to a lot of my runners about too, and I joke around with them about, is when I'm doing a running analysis, or they'll show me pictures, or videos from like races or from track workouts and such, right? I'll see them in person. And I see towards the end of these races or track workouts, I'm like, so if it's easier when you're upright to breathe, why are you running slumped forward into a ball? Like that's not helpful. The idea is like, everyone fatigues, but in reality, maybe like as a PT too, we need to do a better job of helping individuals prepare for their event so they can maintain the best running form, kind of for that entire distance. So like, as I was alluding to before, so not just saying for this individual, like, okay, well, lean backwards a little bit when you're running, or try to be more upright. Again, that may last a couple minutes, but translating to their performance kind of in the real world or in these situations when they become fatigued, that's not gonna do it. So it's kind of working on these building blocks that will then, translate for the long term, because they're not just focused on always like improving time, right? But we want to improve durability of the runner. So kind of some key points from just what I just talked about. Consistency is one of the most important things. So consistency in your running. So in general, like what we do see with elites is, yes, and just runners in general, we take some time off, of course, like after races and things like that, but are pretty consistent in building these trainings on top of each other. And you probably know if you take a long time off and trying to get back to running, it feels like awkward and uncomfortable, like it kind of comes back, but you're kind of starting from square one. I would say see a PT before you are injured. So my favorite patients are the ones that are not injured, or they have like a niggle maybe, or something that they feel like is coming on, but it's not a full-blown injury, because then we can work on like preventing them, or work on mitigating the chances of that. And then I can see at baseline, like, okay, how do you actually move? Because when you're injured, you're already altering your movement. So I don't really get a good idea of how do you move naturally, or what's your baseline, right? And then I really like to consider the whole picture. So research shows that running by itself, like if you just run, this does not improve bone density, does not maintain muscle strength, and it does not improve stability. So as much as we love running, we're also missing a lot, right? And so we also want to consider age-specific needs. So for example, when I have individuals who are older, so older than like 40, 50, kind of that age range, I focus a lot making sure they're getting in the gym, making sure they're doing strength training, because at that point, their tendons, and tissues are more brittle, they're stiffer, and they're weaker. So we need to work on building tendon and muscle density. Whereas in the younger population, we see a lot of the bone stress injuries. I see a lot of stability issues because they're growing. So there's a lot of those changes. And life in general and your running career is really this journey. And so my job is to kind of help you along that journey based on your needs and kind of how those change over time. And in running, the biggest thing, we have this obsession, which I do too, but with volume and with pace. But we have to stop romanticizing those and this obsession with it and start taking responsibility for actually the quality of the effort we're putting into our running, or else we're going to go through this cycle that's not going to stop. And it's really going to be hard to see progress in your running because you're just never going to get past this certain point before you start injuring yourself again. And so this next section, I call it decoding running a little bit. So I'm going to break a couple things down by joint, and then also looking at tissue capacity. So when we look at joint by joint, so we have different components of our body here that contribute to running in some way. So our scapula, so it really complements that postural integrity. So that posture piece of things. Our core really provides that counter rotation to preserve our center of mass. Our hips, so many things, but really driving propulsion, steering and controlling our posture. Our knees are really helpful for like dampening braking and that vertical load. Ankles are for a lot of that propulsion and elasticity through that Achilles tendon. And then our feet are this adaptive lever that really controls those forces throughout the ankle. So all of these things really have to work in conjunction. So I work with a lot of coaches as well. And I ask them, I'm like, can all your athletes actually do these things well? Do them well under fatigue and do them well day after day, right? So we're having them run all these miles, but are they able to control all these parts of their body? And I see a lot of runners come in that are like running 80 to 100, plus miles a week. But I assess them and they can't do a single leg squat with good form. I'm like, you do understand running is a series of single leg squats. So in a marathon, think about how many you're essentially doing. And if you can't do one with like control and good form, think about how much you're loading your body in ways that probably over time are going to be causing issues. So when we look at these joints, this is generally like things that might increase load to these certain areas that I consider when I'm rehabbing someone or when I'm trying to limit their potential for injury based on their movement, and then also things that reduce loading. So for the hip, we think about things that increase loading, such as running uphill, a weaving gait pattern, so like a crossing over. So I tell people, example of this, if you feel like you have scuff marks all the time on the inside of your legs, or if like dirt or something, or you feel like you hit your ankles a lot or kick yourself a lot, that's kind of that weaving gait pattern. So a lot of load on the hip. Anterior tilt, so kind of where your pelvis is tilted forward. So this would look like kind of your butt sticking out or your stomach sticking forward type of thing, like an increase in that back extension. I see a lot of hamstring strains with this, or a lot of impingement in the front of the hip. And then increased hip adduction. So essentially that your legs are really close together when you run. So similar to that weaving gait pattern, or you might like hit your knees together when you're running, really increases load to the hip. Things that decrease loading, slowing your pace, and increasing your cadence are big ones for that. For the knee, things that increase loading, so lower cadence, which is like a lot of overstriders as well when you're running faster. This one might be surprising to people, but actually more cushion in your shoes increases knee loading. And medial posting. So if you have a medial post in your shoe, that puts a lot of compression through that medial part of the knee, or the tibiofemoral joint. Things that reduce knee loading are more of a midfoot, forefoot contact, more minimal shoes, increasing your cadence, and also running uphill reduces knee loading. And then for ankle, increased loading would be like more of that forefoot strike. If you're running faster, if you're running uphill, treadmills, a lot more ankle loading, and also more minimal shoes. So things that reduce, again, increasing cadence, like a high drop shoe or a rocker sole shoe, and also running slower. So as you can see, there's a lot of crossover here, and you can see that like some things that might increase loading in one joint decrease than the other. So that's why I as a PT am like very specific about what I prescribe to people, right? Because it's based on that specific area of their body, and I have to understand that it might so increase loading in other areas. And then kind of shifting from the joints and moving a little bit more now to tissues when we think about this. I'm going to go through bone, muscle, and tendon. So with bone, how does bone actually build? How does it get injured? How do we rehab? So essentially with bone, when collagen molecules in the bone are stressed, there's an electric potential that's generated within that bone that attracts bone building cells, or like the osteoblasts. And then minerals like calcium are deposited onto that strained side of the bone to then increase bone density. So what we see is that this process goes continuously as we're running, as we're doing other things. But if we kind of exceed that capacity, we don't have primarily enough like energy availability, or we're in that overtraining state, we end up with this guy, right? We end up with like a stress fracture, stress reaction, injury to the bone. And what we know about building bone is that high impact sports enhance bone density and geometry. So this is your soccer, or basketball, gymnastics, those multi-directional sports. We see that low impact sports lead to only a modest increase in bone density over even like sedentary individuals, so like running. And then non-impact sports like biking or swimming are really associated with lower bone density sometimes than even sedentary controls. So thinking about that running kind of falls in this middle, and that a lot of the higher impact is actually where we get those beneficial improvements in our bone. So for bone building potential, I always think this quote's funny that bone cells think running is boring, and they have lower ground reaction forces applied to the ground when we're running in really short contact times. And this really isn't effective to build bone. But if you were previously participating in ball sports, so like your basketball, soccer, lacrosse, things like that, research has shown that there's actually a 50% reduction in stress fractures. And I know there was a study for if you played soccer in particular, there's like this 30-year span of protection, of bone protection after that point. Because these sports do have a higher impact and rate of force development, they become stiffer, stronger, and more resistant bones. And when you think about these sports that are multidirectional, you are loading your bone in so many different ways. And if any of you have ever heard of Wolff's Law, which is essentially like how much you load it is how it's going to build. If we're loading it in a ton of different directions, we're going to get a really strong bone. Whereas running, we are pretty much loading it in the same direction and same force consistently over a long period of time. So we really want to incorporate these jumping activities that load quickly, and these are really critical. So these are ground reaction forces. So the force from the ground coming back up to your body, greater than 3.5 times your body weight, with these like peak forces, quick peak forces. These are most effective. And when we think about this, and when I'm prescribing jumping to my athletes as well, bone really only responds to like the first 20 to 40 jumps. So you don't need to be doing like 500 single leg hops every night. You probably hurt yourself more. But just highlighting here, like plyometrics, and I'm sure Sarah has emphasized these too, and I know we do them with Nell. They're not just for performance, right? They're for bone health too. So yes, they help increase performance, but people forget that it's also really good for protecting your bone and strengthening your bone. So if there's anything, in terms of limiting potential for bone stress injuries as well, besides, some of the nutritional pieces of it and the progressive overload with training, is to do plyometrics, because you're really building that bone density in a sport where we're not really able to do that. And then moving into tendons. So I'm just going to kind of focus a little bit on like the Achilles tendon in particular, because that's really important for running. So essentially our muscles are acting as these tensioners, right? And then our tendons are supplying this recoil. So tendons really act as this electric power generator, and their role and efficiency is dependent on the rate at which they're loaded. So how long we're in stance, so how long we're in the ground, can really affect our like musculoskeletal strain and impact the economy of our running. And we really want to promote this uniform strain through the tendon, because that will help with remodeling. So depending on how people run, they may be loading it abnormally, which may put more strain on one side than the other, or front, back, that type of thing. And that's what kind of causes or can contribute to some of those tendinopathies. And essentially, when you have a tendon issue, or like Achilles tendinopathy, for example, it's really a strain distribution problem. And this high compression on the tendon causes a lot of collagen disorganization. And so that can cause a lot of distress within the tendon. But when we think about rehabbing a tendon, so essentially we have this like collagen structure organization issue, right? So we need to improve the tendon tolerance to load. So if you kind of look at this picture here, you can see how nice and clean like a normal tendon should look. And then if you look at abnormal, you can see all this like mess essentially, right? So collagen fibers are usually supposed to be like a parallel, but when you have a tendinopathy, they kind of are this like mesh crisscross all over the place. So we need to work on kind of breaking those apart and realigning the fibers and then making sure it can tolerate its load. So in rehabbing tendons, we kind of go through several different phases. Usually we go through this first phase where the person's essentially having a period of relative rest. We're probably unloading it for a little bit. In Achilles situations, usually putting in like a heel lift. We're looking at if there's any other inflammatory components around the tendon that might be causing an issue. We try to avoid things like excessive dorsiflexion, or kind of like where you're pulling your toes up to the sky. That causes a lot of compression on your Achilles tendon. In this phase, we're having people do a lot of cross training as well. And at the beginning stages, we want to do a lot of isometric exercises to reduce any types of reactive tendinopathy. So this might be like moderate to heavy loads, kind of a mid-range in terms of range of motion, holding for like 40 to 60 seconds for a few reps. Once we kind of get through that, and essentially we're getting through this like period of like high reactivity of the tendon, we can kind of go into phase 2 where it's more understanding and addressing the actual mechanism of injury. So again, looking at those capacities, like understanding why the person got this in the first place. So finding training errors or the weak link or a technique issue. So a lot of the times with Achilles, I'm looking at their foot. Because that rear foot control and through the Achilles is really dependent on their forefoot function, and also looking up at the hip. So if there's proximal factors that are compromising that foot function. So a lot of the time I'm working too on like that intrinsic foot strength. So if you've been to PT for any type of plantar fasciopathy or like Achilles tendinopathy, you probably have done like things like toe yoga or like the deep intrinsic foot strengthening or balance exercises. So we're really trying to get the foot to actually work, because poor foot control overloads strain in those non-contractile tissues, right? Or like the tendon. So we want to make sure the foot's working. And then once we kind of start working through that and building, we go to more of this phase 3 or this mechanotransduction, which essentially means turning movement into repair. So the body responds really well to load over time as compared to just rest for a long period of time. So essentially what happens is when you're moving and when we're doing exercises for this, we're shearing cell walls. And this really initiates certain cell pathways that can create different RNA and things like that to create collagen and really repair this matrix. So essentially breaking it apart and then loading it in a normal way to help it heal. So that's why it's really critical to make sure we're doing things with proper form. So with rehabbing tendons too, how do I prescribe movement and load when overload really got us to the injury in the first place? And it is just this gradual increase in the muscle and tendon ability to tolerate and produce force and load. So I prescribe this, again, some of the things I already talked about, but considering the time it's under tension, the speed of contraction, so range of motion, position. I'm emphasizing a lot of mid-range mobility to avoid that compression like I talked about. We know Achilles forces are really high at peak dorsiflexion, allowing rest days for the collagen regeneration. So pain, I tell people when they experience pain during a session with Achilles stuff, that's okay. It's not indicative of damage, but we just want to make sure we're allowing sufficient recovery for that. And we also need to know for tendons, this takes a long time. So people want immediate fixes. They want me to stick every single needle I can in them. But Achilles and, any type of tendon issue does take a few months to kind of resolve, mostly because there's also not a lot of blood supply in tendon. Like bone heals really well. There's a lot of blood supply. Muscle heals fairly well, but tendons, ligaments, there's not a good blood supply there. So it just takes a little bit longer. And as I mentioned, we really want to progress load only with correct mechanics. So we want to go slow. Tendons respond really well to slow and heavy loads. So if you've been in PT for an Achilles tendinopathy in particular, we're going really slow through like eccentrics and things like that, because that's how tendons respond best. We work up to doing eccentrics with heavy loads. We're working more on sports-specific movement patterns, plyometrics. And we really need to make sure we're targeting each of these loading parameters deliberately. So working on like high cumulative loading, so a lot of steps, working on the energy storage and release through our plyometrics, and working on high load per step, so that heavy, slow resistance training. And lastly, I'll just touch on muscle. So with a lot of strength training, are we really loading our muscle? So if we need to increase ankle power to run faster, which like the calves in particular, Achilles tendon, all of that is huge in our propulsion, so our forward movement. But things like single leg squats, people aren't going to target our soleus or like our deep calf muscle as much as actually focusing on that muscle and doing something like a seated calf raise. What I see is that a vast majority of people's loaded calf work is actually loading the calf complex less than we see during running. So if you think about how much force goes through your calf and Achilles during running, and then people are holding like a 5-pound dumbbell and doing calf raises, it's like you're probably not even coming close to stressing that muscle enough for it to rebuild. So this is where like that heavier strength training really comes in. And then in terms of aging, so, use it or lose it, right? So again, as I mentioned at the beginning, running is not sufficient enough stimulus for preserving lean body mass. And there was research done that showed men who started strength training in their 80s actually increased lean body mass. So that's why I work with people like over 40 when those tendons, muscles start becoming brittle, to go to the gym. Because it's really important for limiting these types of injuries, because this is what we see in kind of that 40 plus population. And if you know who Frank Shorter is, big runner back in the day. But I love that quote from him and really emphasizing how he gets in the weight room still and, is able to see a lot of progress there. So to kind of summarize, things I talked about, in general, running is not rapid and high enough for us to increase bone mineral density. It's not slow enough, like I mentioned, to increase tendon density, and it's not enough load to increase lean body mass. So this is kind of my framework or my comprehensive model for success as a PT and touching on all these core capacities. So if you come in to see me, I'm starting off with like mobility. So I'm looking, are there mechanical blocks or stiffness within your body that is limiting the amount of movement you can do? And okay, we work through that. We have this new movement. Now let's work on stability. So training your neuromuscular strategy. So I use the analogy of like, you can't fire a cannon from a canoe, right? Like you need that stability. And with running, you need that stability for, 26.2 miles or further. Then I move into strength. So then I'm loading these patterns that the person has developed with mass to really build skill. And then I transition into power. So that I'm increasing, that's where apply metrics come in. So increasing rate and speed of skill. So it's really, starting to look at things differently. So we're looking at movement, we're looking at tissue capacity. We're looking at the individual and their uniqueness and also what their long-term goals are. And we really need to put attention into all of those and in conjunction with, their running and how much they want to do. And as a PT, I really just emphasize, as much as and I do too, as much as we all love running, like how important these other components are to let you be doing this for the long term. So thank you, everyone. That's it.
Great job, Jenna. That was so good. Does anyone have any questions for her? The floor is open. Anything and anything. Anything and everything?
Yeah.
I feel like I have a lot of questions. That was so interesting, especially
great.
as someone who does not do anything in the medical field. So it was a really good lesson. I think one thing, so I'm in my first marathon training cycle in like 6 years, and I never used to strength train, and then luckily I have, and it's made a lot of difference. But as race season gets closer, I think a lot of us are in peak weeks. Mileage is ramping up. I know it's okay to sort of drill back, but do you have any suggestions on how we can do the right things to prevent injury, especially in this critical time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, that's exciting for you. I'm very excited for you. And I'm glad that the strength training has been beneficial. I always like to hear that. So usually so I'll take a step back. Like if I'm starting with a runner, I like to start sometimes before their marathon cycle or at the very beginning during that base building. And I focus that phase a lot on that like hypertrophy or like that heavy strength training. Cause like the workouts aren't as like critical. Like it's like, if you're a little sore for a workout, it's, not do or die at that point kind of thing. And then as you start getting closer, so around where you are, at that point, I'm in more this maintenance phase. I'm like, let's like keep you lifting, like let's keep it, but let's like drop the weight, drop the intensity. So you're still giving it a stimulus to the muscles to help limit injury, but that might be, you know, more where instead of trying to do like a max deadlift or something, I'm like, let's do something with like 10 to 12 reps. Let's keep your body fluid and moving, keep some stimulus, but where it's not creating, you know, tearing of the muscle or soreness. And especially in those last like week or so before the race, a lot of it I'll stick to like mobility. I'll stick to core. I'll stick to band work, things like that. I don't really want to add too much stimulus because just as you taper your running, I want to taper your strength training as well.
Jenna, I have a question.
Mhm.
So currently, well, I'm currently sick. So this whole week was a recovery week. So I haven't been ran for a few days, but I've been dealing with a new injury, like a little injury or a little, I don't even know what you want to call it, but I have like this calf issue. So I just saw sports medicine today about what my issue is because I'm having like odd pain, like it just travels all around my calf. I could feel it laterally, posteriorly, anteriorly. And at first I thought like there's a compilation of like it could be a peroneal nerve, tibialis muscle, and all that stuff. My question is, when someone has like soft tissue, tendons, ligaments, whatever, injury during the acute phase, do you recommend icing? Because I've been icing like the last like 2 weeks that I've had like this issue, like a couple of times a day and more frequently when I'm home. But then now I found out like studies are showing like if it's a chronic issue, you don't ice, you heat.
Mhm, mhm.
I mean, so what's I don't even know what's the right thing because like my sister, she's a marathoner too. She's like, I just read an article and there's a study saying like don't ice anymore. You should do heat. I'm like, oh, for love of God, what am I supposed to do?
Right? And they're always changing things on us. Keep up, right? Yeah, no, it's so my thing with heat and ice, and a lot of the time, depending on the person, is I'm like, what's most comfortable for you? What makes you feel the best? To be completely honest, sometimes with ice, I say if there's inflammation and if it's acute, sometimes ice can help reduce the inflammation initially. I don't like it for prolonged periods for tendons and things because essentially you are with ice kind of stopping or limiting circulation to the area. And at the time in the acute phase, we want to increase blood flow to that area to heal and bring those nutrients. So sometimes I'll just say like, you know, you don't need to be doing it all the time or for like hours on end. But if you went for like a run or something and just feel like you need to kind of calm it down a little bit and that feels good, you know, that's totally great. The idea with heat, and that a lot, I think the literature is showing that is kind of those opposite effects. So it is warming up that area. It's bringing like increasing blood flow, opening up those vessels. So it's bringing more nutrients to heal the area. I wouldn't put that over like an active inflammation site, but that's why it's for like more chronic to try to induce some sort of, you know, blood flow or reintroduce that to the area. I like heat for chronic things as well, tendinopathies, things like that. I think it just warms things up, especially if you're going to do movement after, or like PT or exercises. Sometimes, I mean, you know, if you run on cold muscles, it doesn't feel great, right? So kind of warming up that area first can sometimes be beneficial, especially for like soft tissue, calf stuff. And if you're not really 100% sure what's going on, sometimes like heat and then movement can be helpful. Like I mentioned, I think movement's really good for it more than just like letting the muscle sit. Because if we sit, things tighten and things shorten over time if we're not kind of working on moving that around.
I've noticed that like because I'm in the hospital, so like when I like start my cases and whatnot, like I'm sitting and I'm monitoring my patients. So and even on the car drive to work, it's about like 55 minutes. And when I get out of the car, I feel like it's achy. But then the more I work or when I start walking and I do like certain calf exercises, even when I'm in the operating room, it feels better. Is it just because I'm immobile and everything's just tight and then I'm loosening it? So is it good to do those stretches is what I'm asking.
Oh yeah, movements. I mean, long
The
car
stretch.
rides. Yeah, like long car rides, plane rides. Sometimes I have people wear like compression socks, compression sleeves.
Yeah, I wear
something-
the sleeves
Yeah,
too,
keep something
compression
moving.
socks.
But yeah, you think about it. I mean, a lot of us too, and me included, like when you wake up in the morning, I think it takes me a couple minutes to get out of bed now. I'm like, things hurt, or like things are stiff. Like you've been in one position.
Just wait.
Been like one position for a long time. And so things just kind of get really stiff. So sometimes I tell people move before you walk, like kind of get some gentle movement in, like things like for the calf, like ankle pumps, or like those like ankle alphabet things, like something just to get some movement in there before you like start just getting up and going. Cause then I see people go from cold to hot real quick. And that's when they like cause more strain or tear, because the muscle's just not prepared for that. It's essentially usually a muscle issue, and it's just really straining that tendon or pulling on that tendon a lot.
So then do you recommend your athletes, the runners that you treat, do you recommend them to change the terrain of where they're training? Because that when I saw an orthopedic surgeon, just to kind of take a look at what was going on, he's like, where do you run? I go, well, I run right after work and I'm just running around the neighborhood. He's like, well, yeah, you're on sidewalks and it's uneven and on curbs. He's like, that's a lot of stress and load on your muscles and all that stuff. He says, switch up the terrain and run on like crushed limestone, and track is great, and even your treadmill. So is that what you recommend, like for your athletes, just to kind of like unload some of that hard pounding on concrete?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. When you think about running, we are doing the same thing all the time.
It's repetitive.
In the same place all the time. Our body remembers that. And so I tell people, no matter what surface it is, like it's good to have some variability. So your load, just like changing shoes, which I know Sarah has talked about too, like variety in shoes. And like shoes take time to kind of get back to their normal stance before you can go back in them and things like that. And it's kind of nice to do that because then different muscles are working too. So if you're wearing the same shoes all the time, running the same route all the time, same surface all the time, your muscles are all working in the same way all the time. That puts a lot of strain on them. So yeah, I mean, sometimes it's nice getting on softer surface. Some people feel like it's harder running on softer surface. Some people like the treadmill. Some people feel better on the road. So sometimes I don't do as much surface, or I don't say you have to run on this. I just say like add variability to what you're doing. Okay. Usually for calf Achilles issues, I will say avoid hills or avoid uphill, because that puts a ton of strain on the calf and Achilles area. But besides that, it's more like I'm talking to them about different ways, like while they're running, things they can think about, as compared to like being like you have to completely change the surface you're running on, because sometimes it's like not feasible, right? Like we have to adapt to like what the person can actually do. Like I'm not going to say, okay, you get out of work, now you have to go drive an hour to a trail. Like sorry, but figure it out or something. So kind of helping the person to adapt to like meet them where they're at in that. But I would just say add variability. But you don't have to do one surface versus the other.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question or a comment. I don't know. I'm suffering my first stress fracture, and it sucks.
I'm sorry.
And I guess I'm curious, like Sarah, we're 3 weeks into this, something like that, of resting, and I'm doing my best to cross train like a queen, and my shoulders still hurt from swimming for the first time in 2 years. But I guess I'm curious, like what, other than cross training and things like that, like what does recovery look like? What does like reintroduction with running look like? You talked about the jumping and the weights and all of that, and that seems counter to what I feel like I should be doing right now. So I'm just curious what, I guess, recovery and reintroduction back to running looks like from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm so sorry. I know I've had those too, and they're not a fun time. So I'm sorry that you're going through that. You will get through it. Bone heals very well if you let it. So it'll be okay.
That's what I keep hearing.
I promise you it will. And you'll come back stronger from it. But in terms of, so a lot of the stuff I was talking about, jumping, like heavy weights, all that kind of stuff, I mean, that's usually like I want people doing that kind of before too, like to limit the potential to get a stress injury. You will do that eventually in your recovery. It depends where your stress fracture was as well. So like things like femoral neck and sacrum, or femur in general, take a little bit longer to heal, like more 12, 16 weeks. Like tibia, fibula, some of the metatarsal bones are a little bit quicker than that. Depends on the grading and everything. So typically what I tell people too is you're doing this period of cross training. I tell people do a lot of strength work for the opposite limb. So I'll have people do like bridges. I'll have people do calf raises, single leg squats for the other side. I will have people do single leg hops on the other side, because you don't want to lose bone density on your good side either,
Right.
because that's what happens, right? You know, so I'm like, load your good side. And also there's this translation essentially in some essences that research shows to the other side. So by increasing stimulus on one side, there's this crosstalk a little bit to the other side. So I'll have people come in early on with their stress injuries and I'll be working the other side. I do tons of core work with them. I'll do stability work. I will do things on the stress fracture side. Just initially it might be until you're allowed to weight bear. I'll do stuff in non-weight bearing. So like clamshells or like, you know, some sort of band work, things like that, where they're like lying,
Right.
give stimulus to the bone as well. I focus a ton on sleep. So things that might not seem like a PT thing, but focus a ton on sleep, focus a ton on nutrition. So that's huge. Just because your body is working very hard to heal that bone. And if it does not have the nutrients it needs, it will not repair and it will take a lot longer to heal. Once someone can start weight bearing, I will want them to get up. Essentially, this takes time, but get up to like 45 minutes to an hour of walking before I used to do like a walk run type progression. And then essentially, which I'm sure Sarah will help you with, is kind of this like return to run progression of like this walk run that turns to a run. Then you start kind of building that up over time and kind of having that cross training to maybe make up some of the volume. I'll have people do, like a lot of runners, it's like, because they get antsy and they're like, well, I need to do more than run for 2 minutes, like go do the bike, like, you know. But I tell people with bone stress injuries, I do not accumulation wise want you more than an hour and a half of doing exercise. Like no one should really be doing that more in general, unless you're like elites, because you're crossing over into this like overtraining sense. And that's a lot of stress on the bone, especially when it's recovering. So even cross training, like I have some professionals that I've seen that will do like 3 hours. Like I had a collegiate athlete, femoral stress injury, did 3 hours of cross training a day.
Oh my God.
Like you have to realize like that is still increasing your cortisol. That's still a lot of stress to the body,
Right.
that you're not recovering. So you do have to like that period of rest, but it's this like gradual build. But if you're like 3 weeks in, I'm not sure where your injury was or how bad, but like you're probably getting to the point where you could start weight bearing fairly,
Yeah, it's in my shin, or my tibia. And I wasn't ever fully non-weight bearing. Like I wasn't in a boot. I've been walking some, like I noticed more than like 20 minute walk, I get sore, but they kind of said just within pain tolerance, basically. So
Yep.
not at 0, I guess, which is good.
Yeah. And you can definitely, I'd start to introduce lifting pretty early. I think we underdose stress fractures a lot. So as long as, I tell people, as long as you're not like, it feels the same as the other side. There's not like this soreness during it and it's not lingering. It's okay. You're not going to take like 500 steps back per se, but you don't want to push it. Like if I tell people in that walk run progression, if you start feeling something, you need to do 3 days of cross training after that and then start like a step back before you can like progress again. So a lot of it is this symptom progression. I know you like, and Sarah will be great helping you out with that piece of it. But a lot of the stuff you can do in the meantime is, supplementing with cross training, getting some strength training in, and, maybe like doing more of the plyometrics on the opposite side and then focusing on things like sleep and nutrition too.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Can I ask another question? Am I like talking too much?
Before
So
Judy,
yeah.
you asked Judy, can you send me an email with an update?
Oh, I'll send you an email.
Okay.
I have a question, Jenna, about injury. Like, and Melody, I'm sorry. I had a femur stress fracture last fall. So it was like 3 months of like nothing. But I was listening to like when I had this injury, like the fracture last fall, and they were talking about bone, like stress fracture versus like tendon, ligament, or soft tissue. And of course, with bone fracture, no like running and whatnot, just to heal. But with tissue or tendon ligaments, they encourage you to exercise because, like you said, tendons like loading. So I guess my question is, you can still, like for me, like I can run to pain, correct? but if it gets worse, that's when you should shut it down. Is
Yeah.
that what?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So like like if it's Achilles tendinopathy, for example, if that's kind of like, or a, muscle type thing, pain to an extent, like, everyone tolerates pain differently. I don't want like, I'm going to push to like 10 out of 10 emergency room pain and then I'll shut it down. Like I'm talking like if it's a 2 out of 10, 3 out, like I don't want more than a 3 out of 10 discomfort. And I don't want it getting worse throughout the run. And I don't want it lingering after the run. So it's kind of monitoring those components of it. Bone, you just don't want to really be experiencing pain at all because it can continue to break it. Like, I mean, you're breaking the bone. Whereas tendon, it's like, okay, if you're feeling a little bit during it, it's okay. We just don't want hours after that it's causing issues or like, gets really bad the next day type of thing. And so a lot of it is like it depends thing. And it's kind of seeing like, how does that person respond to that little bit of load? But yeah, I wouldn't, like you can still move and run like with sometimes, like unless it's in the really acute phase or like if you strained a muscle or something, like you can run a little bit. Like it's not like a hard shutdown. It's just maybe like, okay, initially take like a little bit of time off and then slowly introduce it. Just that's why sometimes muscle and tendon take a really long time because people aren't like necessarily shutting it down at the beginning and pushing too quick. It takes months. And they're like, I've had a hamstring strain for like 10 months. And I'm like, well, like, and they're like, well, I've been running still like 50 miles a week. And I'm like, okay, well, like, kind of have to work through that piece of it too. And I think it's hard as runners because if we can run, we will. And bone injuries a lot of the time are the one thing that will shut
us down.
Yeah. Yep. I just saw a question. Did someone have about bone pain versus difference between bone pain and tendon pain? Yeah. So, yeah, because as a PT too, sometimes I have people come in and it's like they have something going on or some pain like in their calf or something, or their shin or their thigh. And sometimes we have to like differentially diagnose a little bit or kind of figure out like, is it bone? Is it muscle? Like what's going on? Sarah knows, but I actually had this for myself recently, but it can be hard. And a lot of the times bone pain can sometimes, like if you're suspecting a bone injury, sometimes it can be a very deep pain, very deep aching pain, night pain a lot. Like if you're laying in bed and it's like you're feeling deep aches at night. Then during the day, like just like walking on it typically hurts. There's usually a very small radius of a spot like that you could like push on that hurts. I usually say if it's within like 5 centimeters or so, it's a higher likelihood of a stress fracture. If it's greater than that, up to like 10 centimeters, it's usually more of like a muscle or a tendon. But so kind of like a small localized point. Tendon, muscle, like tendinopathies can become very painful where it feels like a bone injury. But usually sometimes it warms up or it gets better as you start going, whereas bone will get worse most of the time as you start going. Tendons will respond really well to like a massage or like dry needling or things like that. Whereas bone, like if you get shockwave or you get ultrasound on it, it's hurt a ton. And dry needling might help initially. And people are like, oh, I feel good. But then it comes back. And I tell people a big thing to be careful of is bone injuries can start as muscle or tendon pain. So some people will just get really bad, like they'll feel like they have peroneal tendonitis and they'll feel like when I had a fibular stress fracture and like my peroneals were like really tight and I was getting tightness around the ankle and everything. And I was like, I don't know, I just have really bad tendinopathy. And then it eventually got worse and worse, but it can start off like that because your body's trying to protect the bone. So it will spasm and it'll tighten around that bone. So sometimes people initially think it's something and they'll run to a point where it becomes like a stress fracture because then they'll get to a point where it hurts to walk on or something. But sometimes it can start off. So it can be really hard. Like, and I'm not 100% with it. I've sent people for MRIs that it ends up being a tendinopathy. And I'm like, well, great. I like to be safe with it because unless you get an MRI is the gold standard to know that. So as a PT, we have a lot of testing. There's different like fulcrum testing, or we will do different just pressing around on bone. We have different ideas and like education on how to, like get an idea of what might be going on, or kind of that cluster of signs and symptoms. I ask a lot of like personal questions too about your health status that can give me ideas too, or changes in training. But yeah, like usually, MRI at the end of the day, if it's kind of we're not sure, is usually like the gold standard I'll send people out for. because x-rays, some people do, but x-rays are not sensitive enough to show bone injuries unless it is a fracture most of the time.
That's great. I think we have one question in the chat box from Matt.
Oh, acupuncture do offer gait analyses and shoe recognition. Yes. So we do a lot of gait analyses. We actually just got this new sensor. It's called Run Easy. And we've been doing a lot of running analyses on those because we can get really granular data from like how you're running. We can get like, you know, all the mechanics of how you're running and get really good recommendations from that. So we do that a lot for people. And then, yeah, I mean, we'll look at your shoes. We'll see, you know, we'll do assessments and like help people try to figure out what might be some good options for them as well. But yes, we do offer all that kind of stuff.
Very cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? No? Thank you everyone for joining tonight. I hope you learned something. I mean, I learned a lot. Jenna, you were a great presenter, great teacher. One thing to remember is like whether you're injured or healthy, it's never going to be the same. So if you're in a season of feeling like you have a lot of niggles or you feel like you are injured, it's not going to be like that forever. And like seeing Jenna, seeing a PT in your area will definitely help you kind of build that strength that we want to see, to be able to do what we love the most for the rest of our lives, or as long as we want to do it, which is running. So thanks everyone. Ronald, we missed you, but thanks for joining in. All right.
Oh, my time zones are off, huh?
No, it's tough. I know. Yeah. It was 5 o'clock Mountain.
Got it.
Yeah.
Whoops. All right. Glad everyone had a good time.
Well, I'll send out the recording tomorrow.
All right. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, you're still there. Do you have any like questions?
No. No. I was
Okay.
just gonna absorb knowledge through osmosis.
Great.
I will watch the recording.
Okay.
Thank you in advance.
Yeah. You're welcome. Thanks for joining. I appreciate you.
Bye.
Bye.